Guys, today's video is going to be focusing on economic development and how it affects population patterns, and this is for topic 1 population in the IB geography syllabus. So firstly, to go into the topic, we do need to define the classifications of economic development that we need to know. Well, the World Bank classifies countries into 3 different categories. First is HICs, or high-income countries, where countries have a GNI per capita of over $13,205. About 15% of global populations live in HICs. HICs are like Germany, UK, the US. LICs, or lower income countries, are when a country has a GNI per capita of under $1,085, and around 10% of global populations reside in these. Examples would be like Afghanistan or Haiti. Finally, the middle ground is MICs, or middle income countries, and these are countries with GNIs between $1,085 and $13,205. And most of the world lives here, with about 75% of the global population residing in these. So next we're going to be talking about how economic development affects population distribution. Well, the level of economic development in a country has a huge impact on where people live. At LICs, most people live in rural areas with really high birth rates and limited accesses to jobs or cities. In MICs, urban areas grow rapidly as people move to cities looking for work. And in HICs, most people already live in well-planned cities with access to modern infrastructure. Though these places often face aging populations and shrinking rural towns, still do have really big megacity populations. Let's first start with LICs. LICs have predominantly rural populations due to having a high reliance on subsistence agriculture. There's also very few urban areas, and they're quite underdeveloped, and this limits opportunities for rural to urban city migration. Also, LICs often experience really high population growth rates due to having really high birth rates, but they have low levels of urbanization due to most people living in poverty. There's also a lot of pressure on resources in LICs. This is influenced due to high fertility rate, poor access to education and healthcare, which deepens rural poverty cycles. A really good example of this is Niger, where 80% of people live rurally and the fertility rate is about 7 per woman. It's really high, and there's a lot of pressure on healthcare systems and education systems there. Next, let's go through MICs. MICs typically undergo significant economic and demographic transitions. Industrialization usually drives job creation to cities, prompting rural to urban migration. The urban centers that arise from such changes offer higher wages, better education, and improved healthcare, making them an attractive destination for migrants. MICs are also very diverse, as they constitute about 50% of all countries in the world, and they have about 75% of their global population. For that reason, the world actually divides them into 2 further subcategories. The first one being upper middle income countries, and this is where you see rapid urban growth through economic diversification and increased investment. Really good example of these would be like Brazil, China, Namibia. Then you have your lower middle income countries, and these are the countries that are going through urbanization, but they're still struggling and they're having very few economic and social changes. Good examples of these would be Bolivia and Egypt. Lastly, let's go through HICs. HICs are countries that generally have stable population distributions, and most people live in urban areas. These countries benefit from well-developed infrastructure, diversified economies, and low population growth rates. However, due to those low population growth rates, some places start to experience aging populations, which is when most of the population is older rather than young, and this often slows down urban expansion towards the future and rural depopulation. A really good example of an aging population issue is Japan, where now so many young people have come in, but because they're just working, they're not having kids. So they're starting to have an aging population. Also, a lot of people from the rural areas in Japan, they're moving to some of the urban regions like Tokyo, Osaka, and Nagoya, and dominate population patterns. Meanwhile, rural areas are starting to face depopulation as the younger generations are migrating. Now, Those three are really good classifications, but just comparing countries by rich and poor is really simplistic and it's hard to give accurate definitions. So we use some other more nuanced classifications. First one being MEDCs or more economically developed countries. These are essentially just your HICs, countries like Japan and Germany that are highly developed with really strong economies and high living standards. Next, we have NICs or RICs as well. And these are your newly industrialized country or recently industrialized countries. And these are like, Malaysia, Taiwan, China, countries that have grown in industry since about the 1900s. Um, some NICs, though, they have turned on to become HICs or MEDCs, for example, Singapore and South Korea. We also break down NICs and RCs into two more categories formed by the countries themselves. The first one being BRICS, which are the countries of Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. These are all known for their rapid growth, vast amount of resources, and their high development potential. Another one is MINT, which is Mexico, Indonesia, Nigeria, and Turkey. These also show fast development, even though they're a bit slower compared to the others. We also define some countries by calling them an emerging economy, and these are nations experiencing rapid economic growth and industrialization while transitioning from originally a low income country to a more developed economic country. These countries typically exhibit increasing integration into the global economy, improving in structure, and rising living standards. They're usually characterized by large domestic markets and rapid rural to urban migrations. Some example of these would actually be the BRICS countries, as they are emerging economies. However, China and India, you can now say they've kind of reached that developed level. CPEs are basically countries that are under very strict government control. They're controlled economies. And a good example for this would be North Korea, which is under really strict government control and living standards are higher than low income countries, but since freedom is often limited, it's not that developed, and in fact, there's a lot more issues. Next, you have your oil rich countries, and these are mostly your Middle Eastern countries like Saudi Arabia and the UAE, and they're quite wealthy due to this oil production. However, the wealth is not always evenly distributed across the populations, and there is a bit of an income disparity. Next, we have LEDCs or lower economically developed countries, and these would be countries such as Pakistan and Kenya. And these are less developed countries with lower incomes and low living standards. They could also be called LICs. However, they could also fall, some of them, in the MIC category. Lastly, we have LEDCs, which are the low developed countries, and these are the very, really low ones like Afghanistan and Somalia, and they face the most challenges with really, really low living standards, really widespread poverty, and low economic development throughout. This map here shows all the LDCs in the world. As you can see, there's a lot in Africa, especially Central Africa. You've also got Afghanistan, you've got some countries in Asia, you've got Haiti in the Caribbean, and all these countries, they're struggling to develop, but they could at some point. Next, since we're talking about economic development, it's a good idea to also say, how do we judge whether a country is developed or not? And the three categories we like to break that down into are social indicators, economic indicators, and political indicators. Social indicators are basically the stuff assessing, quality of life and social well-being. A good social indicator would be if there's equal opportunities, there's a good amount of access to services such as education and healthcare. Some of the methods we could use to assess it would be like life expectancy, birth control, and literacy rate. Economic indicators relates to looking at, a country's wealth. We could be looking at a country's employment, their income. Could also be looking at, consumer spending, environmental degradation, trade. Overall, looking whether a country is able to output, make money, and survive. Political indicators look at how effective governments are. It also looks at corruption issues. You can use the corruption index here. It also looks at the integrity and how governments operate in a country. Lastly, these are the big measures of development. These are the ones that are commonly asked about in the exam. And the first one is GDP, gross domestic product. And this is the total value of all goods and services produced in a certain time period in a country. And it's a really good indicator to see, how well a country's doing in terms of output, but it can be a bit wrong because especially in countries like Nigeria, where there's a really big wealth disparity, the rich would be adding to the GDP the most, but that would be a very low percentage of the population, while in fact, a lot of the population aren't contributing as much. They're actually living in poverty. So it's not the most accurate model to use. GDP per capita is just GDP over population, and this basically just almost assigns an average amount of income earned by a person in a country. However, like with GDP, it's not entirely accurate because some people would be adding to it quite a lot, but some wouldn't be due to wealth disparity. You also have GNI, which is the gross national income, and this basically assesses the GDP, but it also adds in people that are sending money from other countries to here. So, for example, a lot of people migrate from countries in Africa and they might sometimes come to Europe and start working there. So they might send some money back to their countries, and that gets added to the GDP. Again, though, some people would be adding more than others. And GNI per head is basically the same idea as GDP per capita. It's the GNI divided by the number of people in the population. So the same issues still exist with them. The best indicator to use is the HDI. And what this does is it assesses multiple different indicators together. So it looks at like GDP, it looks at GNI, but then it also looks at some other indicators like life expectancy, fertility rates, infant mortality rates, education. It looks at all these different factors and then it gives countries a score between 0 to 1. And the higher the score, the more developed country is. And it's quite an accurate model because it uses a lot of different things to measure. However, you could take into consideration the fact that because it's so much data, there could be some issues with having to calculate it all together and seeing what gets assessed more. And that's all for today. Thank you so much for watching the video. This basically just goes through economic development and the population effects on that. In the next video, we'll focus a bit more on the idea of urbanization, looking at megacities, the core-periphery model, and then also now starting to look at case studies because you do need to know some for IB. So we're going to be doing China, and we're also going to be doing South Africa and looking at population distribution between those. Thank you.